The autumn air crackled with tension outside the First Baptist Church of Charlotte. A sea of angry faces surrounded the old brick building, their protest signs cutting through the morning mist. "Stop the lies." False prophet shame on the Whitleys. 8-year-old Landon Whitley stood at the top of the church steps, his small hand trembling in his mother Julie's protective grip. His face, still bearing the scars of the accident, remained remarkably calm despite the hostility before him. "He's manipulating people's faith." Pastor Richard Morgan's voice boomed across the crowd, his finger pointing accusingly at the boy. "This child and his mother are exploiting our congregation's grief for attention." Julie stepped forward, shielding her son. "Richard, please. You know us. You knew Andy. How can you do this?" The mention of her late husband's name only seemed to fuel the pastor's anger. "Your husband was a good man, Julie. Don't dishonor his memory with these fabrications." Landon tugged at his mother's sleeve, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom, it's okay. Jesus said this would happen." 3 months earlier, in the sterile confines of Carolina Medical Center's emergency room, time stood still. The rhythmic beeping of monitors suddenly gave way to the dreaded flatline tone. For the third time that night, Landon Whitley's heart had stopped beating. "We're losing him again," Dr. Sarah Bennett's voice cut through the chaos, starting chest compressions. Julie Whitley pressed her forehead against the cold window of the observation room, her prayers becoming increasingly desperate. She had already lost Andy in the crash. She couldn't lose her son too. Inside the trauma room, the medical team fought frantically to revive the boy. His small body, broken and bruised from the devastating impact, lay motionless on the table. The overhead lights cast harsh shadows across his pale face, making him appear almost ethereal. "Come on, Landon," Dr. Bennett whispered through gritted teeth as she continued compressions. "Fight!" None of them could have known that at that very moment Landon Whitley was experiencing something that would change not only his life but the lives of everyone in their small community. Something that would spark a battle between faith and doubt, love and fear, redemption and condemnation. And it all began with a warm, golden light that seemed to embrace him as his spirit drifted away from the chaos of the emergency room. This was the third time Landon had died that night. But this time would be different. This time he would return with a message that would shake his community to its core. If you found value in Landon's incredible journey and want to witness more powerful stories of faith and redemption, please subscribe to be part of our growing community of believers. Before the accident that would change everything, the Whitley family embodied the American dream in their quiet Charlotte suburb. Andy worked as a respected construction foreman, while Julie taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school. Their son Landon was a bright, curious 8-year-old who loved baseball and Sunday school. They lived in a modest 2-story home on Maple Street, where Julie's flower garden was the envy of the neighborhood. Their involvement with First Baptist Church spanned 3 generations. Andy's parents had helped build the original chapel, and Julie led the children's choir. Every Sunday, the Whitleys occupied the same pew, 3rd row from the front, where Landon would often draw Bible scenes in his notebook while listening to Pastor Richard Morgan's sermons. But their peaceful life shattered 6 months before the accident. The church's building fund, containing over $50,000 for a new youth center, disappeared overnight. As church treasurer, Andy became the primary suspect. Despite his protestations of innocence and 20 years of faithful service, circumstantial evidence pointed to him. Security cameras had malfunctioned that night, and Andy had been the last person seen entering the church office. The accusation spread through the community like wildfire. Longtime friends began avoiding them at the grocery store. Parents withdrew their children from Julie's class, citing trust concerns. Landon found himself eating lunch alone at school, his former friends whispering about how his father was a thief. Andy fought tirelessly to clear his name. He hired a private investigator with their savings, convinced that someone had framed him. The stress aged him visibly, his dark hair grayed at the temples, and deep lines etched themselves around his eyes. Yet he never lost his faith, attending services even as others moved to different pews to avoid sitting near him. Julie stood by her husband unwaveringly. God knows the truth, she would say, holding Andy's hand during particularly difficult moments. She watched helplessly as her usually confident husband grew quieter, more withdrawn. The local paper ran a story about the missing funds, and anonymous letters appeared in their mailbox, demanding they leave town. Landon showed remarkable resilience for his age. When classmates taunted him about his criminal father, he responded with a quiet dignity beyond his years. "My daddy's a good man," he would say, "and Jesus knows it." His unwavering faith touched even some of their harshest critics, though few would admit it publicly. The strain on the family was immense. Their savings dwindled as legal fees mounted. Julie took on extra tutoring jobs, while Andy worked weekends to make ends meet. They had to sell their second car and cancel their planned summer vacation to Disney World, a promise to Landon they'd been keeping for 2 years. Through it all, they clung to their faith in each other. Every night, they would gather in Landon's room for prayers, asking not for vindication but for strength to endure. Andy would often quote from the Book of Job, finding solace in the story of another man whose faith was tested by misfortune. The Sunday before the accident, Andy gave what would be his final testimony to the congregation. Standing before those who had condemned him, his voice steady and clear, he said, "I forgive those who have judged us. I pray that someday the truth will come to light, but even if it doesn't, my faith in God remains unshaken." Some in the congregation wept at his words, moved by his grace under pressure. Others hardened their hearts further, seeing his speech as manipulation. Pastor Morgan, who had once been Andy's closest friend, sat stone-faced throughout the testimony, his own heart torn between duty to his congregation and his growing doubts about Andy's guilt. None of them could have known that within a week their world would be turned upside down in ways they could never have imagined. The tragedy looming on their horizon would not only test their faith but would also expose the true character of their community, leading to revelations that would shake their small town to its very foundations. First Baptist Church had been the heart of the Charlotte community for over 70 years, and Pastor Richard Morgan was its undisputed spiritual leader. A tall, commanding figure with silver hair and penetrating blue eyes, he had guided his flock through countless trials and tribulations. But beneath his authoritative exterior lay a deeply wounded soul. 3 years earlier, he had lost his only son, Tommy, to a drunk driving accident. Tommy's death had transformed Pastor Morgan. Once known for his compassionate nature, he became increasingly rigid in his beliefs, his sermons focusing more on judgment than mercy. His wife, Sarah, had left him a year after Tommy's death, unable to bear his growing bitterness. The congregation whispered about how he would stand for hours at Tommy's grave, engaged in silent conversations with his lost child. The Morgan family's tragedy had divided the community. Some, like elderly Martha Stevens, who had taught Sunday school for 40 years, believed the pastor needed compassion and time to heal. Others, including prominent church elder James Davidson, worried that his grief was clouding his judgment, particularly in handling the Whitley situation. The missing church funds had become a flashpoint for these underlying tensions. When Andy Whitley was accused, Pastor Morgan's reaction seemed driven more by personal pain than pastoral duty. He saw the potential betrayal of trust as an echo of his own loss, another blow to his faith in human nature. His quick condemnation of Andy surprised many who remembered how the two men had once been inseparable, fishing together every Saturday morning. The controversy created distinct factions within the community. The believers, led by Martha Stevens, maintained Andy's innocence and quietly supported the Whitleys. The accusers, rallying behind James Davidson, called for Andy's immediate removal from all church positions. Pastor Morgan's influence swayed many toward the latter group, though his personal stake in the matter raised concerns. Local businesses took sides. Thompson's Grocery, where the Whitleys had shopped for years, suddenly found their credit card system down whenever Julie tried to make purchases. Meanwhile, old Mr. Peterson at the hardware store defiantly extended store credit to Andy, declaring that 30 years of honest business means more than gossip. The children at Riverside Elementary School, where Julie taught and Landon attended, became unwitting participants in the drama. Parents requested class transfers, leaving Julie with the smallest class in school history. Landon faced isolation in the playground, eating lunch alone under the old oak tree where he and Tommy Morgan had once played together. The police investigation stalled without concrete evidence, but the damage to the Whitleys' reputation deepened. Anonymous letters appeared on church bulletin boards detailing supposed evidence of Andy's guilt. Though Pastor Morgan officially discouraged such behavior, he made no real effort to stop it. His own pain seemed to blind him to the suffering of others. Most troubling was the effect on the younger generation. They watched as adults they'd been taught to respect engaged in whispered accusations and social ostracism. Some teenagers, emboldened by the adult behavior, began harassing Landon on his walk home from school. When Julie reported this to Pastor Morgan, his response was tellingly cold. Perhaps this is God's way of teaching accountability. The tension reached its peak when the church board, heavily influenced by Pastor Morgan, voted to suspend Andy's membership pending a full investigation. The meeting lasted 5 hours, with Martha Stevens and her supporters walking out in protest. The next Sunday, attendance was noticeably smaller, with several families choosing to worship elsewhere. What no one realized was how this web of suspicion and judgment had created the perfect storm for the tragedy that lay ahead. The community's division would prove to be the fertile ground from which both incredible miracles and devastating revelations would grow. And at the center of it all would be a little boy whose journey between life and death would force everyone to confront their own beliefs about faith, forgiveness, and the true nature of divine justice. The stage was set for a series of events that would test not just one family's faith, but the very foundation of an entire community's spiritual beliefs. That Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that made everyone in Charlotte feel blessed to be alive. The Whitley family prepared for church as they always had, though the strain of recent months showed in their tired eyes and forced smiles. Andy adjusted his tie in the mirror, his hands trembling slightly as they did now on Sunday mornings. Julie helped Landon with his clip-on tie, smoothing his cowlick with maternal tenderness. The church parking lot was already filling when they arrived. As usual, people averted their eyes or hurried inside when they saw the Whitleys approaching. Only Martha Stevens offered a warm greeting, squeezing Julie's hand as they passed. Inside they took their usual seat, though the pews around them remained conspicuously empty. Michael Thompson, the ambulance driver, sat in the back row that morning, his mind clouded by more than just lack of sleep. His father, Thomas Thompson, shifted uncomfortably beside him, both men carrying a weight that had nothing to do with spiritual burden. They had arrived late, having argued again about the truth they'd been concealing, the truth about the missing church funds. Pastor Morgan's sermon that day focused on redemption, though his words seemed pointed directly at the Whitley family. Confession leads to forgiveness, he declared, his eyes repeatedly drifting to Andy. The Lord knows all our sins, even those we think are hidden. Andy sat stoically, his jaw clenched, while Julie gripped his hand tightly. Landon, innocent to the undertones, continued drawing his Bible scenes. After the service, Andy approached Pastor Morgan, determined to make one final appeal. Their conversation, witnessed by several congregants, grew heated. "Richard, you've known me for 20 years," Andy pleaded. "How can you believe I would steal from our church?" The pastor's response was cold. "The evidence speaks for itself, Andy. Perhaps it's time you spoke the truth." Meanwhile, Michael Thompson stumbled to his car, the weight of his guilt compounded by the flask he'd been nipping from throughout the service. His father's words echoed in his head, "We have to make this right." But Michael couldn't face the shame, couldn't bear to admit that he had helped his father embezzle the church funds, letting an innocent man take the blame. The Whitleys left church in 2 cars that day, Andy in his pickup truck, Julie following in their old sedan with Landon. They planned to meet at home and then take Landon to the park, a small attempt at normalcy in their increasingly chaotic lives. Neither knew that Michael Thompson was on the same road, his ambulance weaving slightly as he responded to a non-emergency call. The events that followed seemed to unfold in slow motion for those who witnessed them. Michael's ambulance, traveling well above the speed limit, crossed the center line on a curve. Andy's truck, in the lead, had no chance to avoid the collision. The impact sent his vehicle careening into a guardrail, the sound of crushing metal echoing through the peaceful Sunday afternoon. Julie, following several car lengths behind, saw the accident unfold with horrifying clarity. She slammed on her brakes, but the ambulance, still out of control, plowed into her car as well. Landon, secure in his back seat, had just enough time to cry out "Mummy" before everything went black. The scene quickly descended into chaos. Passing motorists stopped to help, calling 911 and rushing to the mangled vehicles. Martha Stevens, driving home from church, recognized the cars and fell to her knees in prayer. But Pastor Morgan, receiving the news by phone, felt a cold dread wash over him as he rushed to the scene. Michael Thompson, somehow surviving with only minor injuries, stood in shocked silence, the magnitude of what he had done beginning to penetrate his alcohol-fogged mind. His father, learning of the accident minutes later, knew that their carefully constructed lie was about to unravel in the most tragic way possible. As sirens wailed in the distance, 3 lives hung in the balance: a father, a mother, and a little boy whose journey was about to take him far beyond the boundaries of this world. The small community of Charlotte was about to witness a series of events that would challenge everything they thought they knew about faith, truth, and the power of divine intervention. The emergency room at Carolina Medical Center erupted into frenzied activity as the victims of the crash arrived. Andy Whitley was pronounced dead on arrival, his injuries too severe for any medical intervention. Julie, unconscious and critical, was rushed into immediate surgery, but it was Landon's condition that sent the medical staff into a state of controlled panic. Dr. Sarah Bennett, the lead trauma surgeon, had seen countless accidents in her 15 years of practice, but something about this small, broken body struck a deeper chord. Perhaps it was the way his blonde hair, matted with blood, reminded her of her own son. Multiple trauma, internal bleeding, severe head injury, she called out, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. We need O-negative blood and Page neurology stat. The first time Landon's heart stopped, it was 3:47 p.m. Beginning chest compressions, Dr. Bennett announced, her hands pressing rhythmically on his small chest. The room fell into the choreographed routine of resuscitation compressions, breathing, monitoring. After 3 minutes that felt like eternity, a heartbeat returned, faint but present. Word of the accident spread through the church community like wildfire. The hospital waiting room filled with congregants, divided even now in their reactions. Martha Stevens organized a prayer circle, while others whispered about divine retribution. Pastor Morgan arrived, his face ashen, torn between his role as spiritual leader and his growing sense of guilt over his treatment of the family. At 4:15 p.m., Julie regained consciousness briefly in post-op. "Andy," she whispered. The nurse's eyes filled with tears, but before she could respond, Julie slipped back into unconsciousness. Down the hall, Landon's heart stopped for the second time. The medical team worked with renewed desperation, knowing that each minute without oxygen decreased his chances of survival. Michael Thompson, treated for minor injuries, sat handcuffed in the emergency room, his blood alcohol level well above the legal limit. His father, Thomas, paced the hospital corridors, the weight of their deception becoming unbearable. The missing church funds, the false evidence planted against Andy, the years of embezzlement, it all seemed trivial now in the face of such devastating consequences. As evening fell, the hospital chapel filled with people seeking solace or answers. Pastor Morgan knelt alone in the back row, his prayers interrupted by memories of Tommy's death 3 years earlier. The same hospital, the same helpless waiting, the same crushing guilt. He had blamed the drunk driver who killed his son, letting that anger poison his heart. Now, facing another tragedy caused by alcohol, he felt his carefully constructed walls of judgment beginning to crumble. Just before midnight, Landon's heart stopped for the third time. Dr. Bennett, exhausted but determined, called for the defibrillator. "We're not losing him," she declared, her voice cracking with emotion. The monitors screamed their warning as the medical team fought to bring him back. In the waiting room, Martha Stevens led another prayer, her voice strong and unwavering. "Lord, this child has something left to do here. Please give him back to us." The night seemed endless. Julie, stabilized but critical, was moved to intensive care. The waiting room slowly emptied, though a core group remained: Martha Stevens and her prayer warriors, Pastor Morgan in his solitary vigil, and Thomas Thompson, whose guilt had finally driven him to seek out the hospital chaplain. In the trauma room, Dr. Bennett refused to give up, even as minutes ticked by with no response. Her team continued their efforts, driven by something beyond medical training. Perhaps they all felt it, the sense that this night, this moment was pivotal in ways they couldn't understand. Near the end of that interminable night, Thomas Thompson finally broke his silence. He requested a meeting with Pastor Morgan and the hospital chaplain, his hands shaking as he prepared to confess the truth that had cost Andy Whitley his life. But even as the human drama of truth and consequences began to unfold, something far more extraordinary was happening in Trauma Room 3, where a little boy's spirit hovered between two worlds, about to embark on a journey that would change everything. The stage was set for both tragedy and miracle, for revelations that would shake a community's faith and for messages from beyond that would restore it. And through it all, Landon Whitley's life hung in the balance, his story only beginning as his earthly life seemed to be ending. The first thing Landon noticed was the silence. The chaotic sounds of the trauma room, beeping monitors, urgent voices, metallic clanking of instruments all faded away into a profound stillness. Then came the light, not harsh like the hospital fluorescence, but soft and golden, wrapping around him like a warm embrace. He felt himself floating upward, looking down at his own body on the operating table. Dr. Bennett and her team seemed frozen in time, their faces etched with concern as they worked to save him. But Landon felt no fear, no pain, only a deep sense of peace he had never known before. The golden light grew brighter, and suddenly he was somewhere else entirely. A vast expanse stretched before him, neither heaven nor earth, but somewhere in between. The air itself seemed to shimmer with love and acceptance. In this place, all the confusion and hurt of recent months felt distant, like a half-remembered dream. Then he saw his father. Andy stood before him, whole and radiant, looking exactly as he had before the accusations and stress had aged him. "Dad," Landon called out, running to embrace him. Andy's arms felt solid and real as they wrapped around his son. "I've missed you so much," Landon whispered. "I'm so proud of you, son," Andy said, his voice carrying the same warmth Landon remembered from their Sunday morning pancake breakfasts. "You've been so brave." His father's eyes held no trace of the sadness that had clouded them in recent months. Here he was at peace. Before Landon could ask any of the questions burning in his heart, another presence filled the space. A figure approached, radiating such pure love that Landon instinctively knew who it was. Jesus stood before them, his eyes filled with infinite compassion and understanding. "Welcome, Landon," Jesus said, his voice resonating through Landon's entire being. "You've shown great faith during difficult times." He reached out and touched Landon's forehead gently. In that touch, Landon felt all the pain and confusion of recent months dissolve away. Jesus led them through the shimmering expanse, showing Landon visions of what was happening below. He saw his mother in the ICU, Martha Stevens praying by her bedside. He saw Pastor Morgan in the chapel, wrestling with his conscience. He saw Thomas Thompson preparing to confess the truth. "Your journey isn't over yet," Landon, Jesus said softly. "There is more for you to do." He showed Landon a vision of darkness spreading across the world, not physical darkness, but a shadow of hatred, fear, and lost faith. People are forgetting how to love one another. They're letting anger and judgment poison their hearts. Andy placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You can help them remember, son. You can show them what real faith looks like." The love in his father's voice gave Landon courage, even as he began to understand the weight of what was being asked of him. "It won't be easy," Jesus continued. "Many won't want to hear your message. Some will try to silence you. But remember this moment, remember this love. This is what you're fighting for." He touched Landon's heart, and in that instant Landon understood things that his 8-year-old mind couldn't quite put into words. "Will I see Dad again?" Landon asked, clutching his father's hand tightly. Jesus smiled. "Your father will always be with you, Landon, and when your work is done, you'll be together again. But now, it's time for you to go back." Andy knelt down and hugged his son one last time. "Tell your mom I love her," he whispered. "Tell her I'm proud of how strong she's been. And Landon, tell them the truth about what happened. People need to hear it." The light began to fade, and Landon felt himself being pulled back. The last thing he saw was his father and Jesus standing together, their faces filled with love and encouragement. Then the golden peace gave way to harsh hospital lights and the sudden return of pain. His eyes opened to see Dr. Bennett's astonished face above him. "He's back," she called out, her voice breaking with emotion. "We've got a pulse." The first near-death experience had ended, but Landon's journey was just beginning. He had been given a glimpse of what lay beyond, and a mission that would challenge not just his own faith, but the faith of an entire community. The second time Landon's heart stopped, the transition was even more dramatic. The hospital room dissolved not into golden light, but into a vast cathedral of clouds and shimmering colors no earthly words could describe. This time he wasn't alone in his journey. He saw other spirits, some moving toward the light, others lingering as if waiting for something. Among these souls, Landon recognized a familiar face, Tommy Morgan, Pastor Richard's son. Tommy appeared as he had in life, before the drunk driving accident that took him 3 years ago. His smile was gentle, lacking any trace of the tragedy that had torn his family apart. "I've been waiting for you," Landon, Tommy said, extending his hand. "There's something you need to see." Together they moved through the ethereal space, until they reached what seemed like a window into the earthly realm. Below them, they could see Pastor Morgan in the hospital chapel, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. "My father's heart turned to stone when I died," Tommy explained, his voice filled with sadness. "He let grief poison his faith, turning love into judgment." The vision shifted, showing snapshots of the pastor's descent into bitterness, his wife leaving, his sermons growing harsh, his quick condemnation of the Whitleys. "He needs to know I'm at peace," Tommy said. "That holding on to anger only hurts him more. Will you tell him for me, Landon?" Before Landon could respond, Jesus appeared beside them. This time his expression carried a gravity that wasn't present in their first encounter. He showed them a vision of the growing darkness in their community, neighbor turning against neighbor, faith warping into prejudice, love giving way to suspicion. "The truth must be revealed," Jesus said, his voice resonating with divine authority. "But truth without love brings only more pain. Your message, Landon, must carry both." The vision expanded, showing similar shadows spreading across the world, hearts growing cold, faith becoming a weapon rather than a healing force. Just then, Landon felt the pull back to his body, stronger this time. Tommy's farewell smile was the last thing he saw before the harsh reality of the trauma room snapped back into focus. The medical team had revived him again, but they all knew he wasn't out of danger. The third and final death came near midnight. This time, Landon found himself in what appeared to be a vast library of light. Books of pure energy lined endless shelves, each containing what he somehow knew were human stories, every life, every choice, every consequence interconnected in ways impossible to comprehend with earthly understanding. Jesus stood waiting, but now he was accompanied by a host of angels. Their presence filled the space with music that seemed to vibrate through Landon's very essence. "You've seen what was," Jesus said, gesturing to the cosmic library. "Now see what could be." The vision that followed was both beautiful and terrifying. Landon saw two possible futures unfolding simultaneously. In one, his message of truth and love sparked a renewal of genuine faith in his community and beyond. In the other, his words were rejected, leading to deeper divisions and darkness. "The choice will be theirs," Jesus explained. "Your task is simply to speak the truth in love, no matter the cost." He touched Landon's forehead again, imparting wisdom that went beyond words, understanding that would take years to fully reveal itself. The angels began to sing louder, their harmony carrying a message of hope and warning. "Remember," Jesus said, his voice rising above the celestial chorus, "love is the only force strong enough to drive out darkness. Even when it seems impossible, even when hearts seem completely hardened, love can still break through." As Landon felt himself being drawn back for the final time, Jesus gave him one last blessing. "You'll face opposition, ridicule, and doubt, but you won't be alone. Your father, Tommy, and I will be with you. And through you, many will remember what true faith looks like." The return this time was different, slower, more gradual. As his spirit reconnected with his broken body, Landon carried with him not just memories, but a deep, unshakable conviction. He had been given a gift, a responsibility, and a message that would either heal or divide his community. Dr. Bennett and her team watched in amazement as his vital signs stabilized, stronger than before. Something had changed in their young patient, something their medical training couldn't explain. The real miracle, however, was yet to unfold. The first week after Landon's return to consciousness was a blur of medical tests, hushed conversations, and the steady stream of beeping monitors. Dr. Bennett maintained what she called a cautiously optimistic outlook, though privately she confided to her colleagues that his survival, let alone his coherent state, defied medical explanation. 3 cardiac arrests, severe trauma, and yet here was this 8-year-old boy, not only alive but increasingly alert. Julie, recovering in her own hospital room, insisted on being wheeled to her son's bedside every day. The loss of Andy had carved a hollow space in her heart, but watching Landon grow stronger helped her find the will to heal. She noticed subtle changes in him, a new depth in his eyes, a quietness that wasn't there before, as if he was carrying something profound within him. It was on a quiet Sunday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after the accident, when Landon first spoke about what he had experienced. Martha Stevens was sitting with him while Julie rested, reading him stories from his favorite children's Bible. Suddenly, Landon reached out and touched the page showing Jesus with the children. "He doesn't look like that," Landon said softly. "His eyes are kinder, and when he smiles it feels like being wrapped in the warmest blanket ever." Martha's hands trembled as she set down the book. "You saw Jesus, dear?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. What followed was an account so detailed, so profound, that Martha found herself weeping openly. News of Landon's vision spread through the hospital like wildfire. Medical staff who had witnessed his miraculous recovery listened with a mixture of skepticism and wonder. Dr. Bennett found herself staying after her shifts, sitting quietly in Landon's room, asking gentle questions about what he had seen. His descriptions of the peace he had felt during his clinical deaths made her question everything her scientific training had taught her. The first major test of Landon's story came when Pastor Morgan visited the hospital. He had come primarily to offer pastoral care to Julie, still wrestling with his own guilt over how he had treated the family. But when he entered Landon's room, the boy's face lit up with recognition that went beyond their earthly acquaintance. "Tommy says he loves you," Pastor Morgan, Landon said without preamble. "He wants you to know he's not in pain anymore, and he doesn't want you to be angry." The pastor staggered, gripping the doorframe for support. Nobody had mentioned Tommy to Landon, and the details he shared about Tommy's favorite baseball cap and the treehouse they had built together were things only the Morgan family knew. Julie watched these interactions from her wheelchair, seeing how each revelation from Landon seemed to carry the weight of divine purpose. She remembered Andy's last Sunday testimony about truth coming to light, though she never imagined it would happen this way. When Landon spoke about seeing his father in heaven, about the message of love and forgiveness he had been given, she felt both profound grief and incredible peace. The hospital staff began noticing an unusual pattern. People who visited Landon's room often left changed. The angry became calm, the doubting found hope, and those burdened by guilt felt the first stirrings of forgiveness. Even the most hardened skeptics found themselves affected by the simple, childlike way he described his experiences of the divine. Thomas Thompson, consumed by guilt, finally found the courage to visit. He stood in the doorway, unable to meet Julie's eyes, but Landon called him over with a smile. "Dad says he forgives you, Mr. Thompson," Landon said quietly. "He wants you to tell the truth so you can be free." Thomas broke down, right there in the pediatric ward, and confessed everything: the embezzlement, the false evidence, the years of deception. As Landon's physical strength returned, the impact of his near-death experiences began to ripple outward. Local news reporters attempted to get interviews, but Julie fiercely protected her son's privacy, remembering Jesus' warning about opposition and ridicule. She knew that once Landon was released from the hospital, they would face an even greater challenge, sharing his message with a world that might not be ready to hear it. The recovery process was not without its struggles. Landon suffered from nightmares, not of the accident, but of the darkness he had been shown, the spreading shadow of lost faith and hardened hearts. During these moments, Julie would hold him close, singing the hymns Andy used to love, reminding him that he wasn't alone in his mission. Dr. Bennett, preparing for Landon's discharge, found herself adding extensive notes to his medical file. "Patient demonstrates unprecedented recovery from multiple trauma and cardiac events," she wrote. "Recovery pattern suggests factors beyond current medical understanding." She paused, then added, "Spiritual experience during clinical death appears to have significant impact on healing process." The day before Landon's release, Martha Stevens organized a small prayer gathering in the hospital chapel. The same people who had divided into factions over Andy's accusation now knelt together, united in gratitude for Landon's recovery. Pastor Morgan, his face lined with new humility, led them in prayers of thanksgiving and repentance. As Julie packed up the cards, flowers, and well-wishes that had accumulated in Landon's room, she found a small notebook where he had been drawing. The images gave her chills, detailed sketches of what he had seen during his time between life and death. The golden light, the celestial library, the angels, all rendered with a precision that seemed impossible for his age. Looking at her son, sitting up in bed and chatting with a nurse about heaven, Julie realized that their greatest challenges still lay ahead. Landon's message of truth and love would face resistance from those who preferred comfortable lies and familiar prejudices. But as she watched him smile, that same sweet smile that now carried hints of divine wisdom, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, guided by the love that had brought him back 3 times. The first phase of their journey was ending, but the real test of faith was about to begin. Landon's recovery had been miraculous. Now it was time to see if his message could work miracles in the hearts of others. The Sunday of Landon's first church attendance after his release from the hospital marked the beginning of the opposition. While many welcomed the Whitleys back with tearful embraces, a vocal minority, led by church elder James Davidson, viewed Landon's accounts with open skepticism. "Convenient how this vision clears his father's name," Davidson muttered loudly enough for others to hear as Julie helped Landon to their usual pew. News of Thomas Thompson's confession had divided the congregation further. Some, horrified by their rush to judgment against Andy, sought to make amends. Others, unwilling to face their own role in condemning an innocent man, began questioning the validity of Landon's experiences. The local newspaper, sensing a story, ran a front-page article titled "Miracle or Manipulation." Young boy's near-death claims stir controversy. Pastor Morgan's public apology in support of Landon added fuel to the fire. Davidson and his followers saw it as a betrayal, claiming the pastor's grief over Tommy had clouded his judgment. They began holding separate prayer meetings, discussing the dangerous precedent of allowing a child's visions to influence church doctrine. At Riverside Elementary, Landon's return to school became a flashpoint for controversy. Some parents demanded their children be moved to different classes, fearing his talk of heaven and angels would confuse their kids. The principal, torn between supporting Landon and appeasing angry parents, suggested Julie keep him home until things settled down. The resistance took a darker turn when anonymous letters began appearing in the Whitleys' mailbox. False prophets come in all sizes, one read. Another warned, stop spreading lies about heaven or face God's judgment. Julie collected each letter, her hands trembling but her resolve strengthening, remembering Jesus' warning about opposition. A local TV station aired a segment featuring experts who explained away near-death experiences as oxygen deprivation and chemical reactions in the brain. They interviewed James Davidson, who spoke gravely about the dangers of emotional manipulation in times of grief. Though they invited Julie and Landon to respond, she declined, knowing they weren't ready for the media circus. Martha Stevens and her prayer group became the Whitleys' strongest advocates, forming a protective circle around the family. When protesters began gathering outside their home with signs questioning Landon's story, Martha organized a counter-presence of supporters. Love will always have enemies, she told Julie, but it will also always have defenders. The financial strain began to mount. Julie's teaching position became increasingly untenable as parent complaints continued. Medical bills from their extended hospital stays threatened to overwhelm them, especially after their insurance company initially denied claims related to Landon's miraculous recovery. The house Andy had lovingly maintained now faced possible foreclosure. Dr. Bennett, risking professional criticism, spoke out in support of Landon. I've seen things in my medical practice I can't explain, she told a local medical board, but I've never seen anything like this. Her advocacy cost her some referrals but earned her the respect of colleagues who had witnessed Landon's inexplicable recovery. The opposition reached its peak when James Davidson called a special church meeting to discuss the theological implications of allowing unverified spiritual experiences to influence our congregation. The meeting turned heated, with accusations and Bible verses flying back and forth. Pastor Morgan, finding his new humility tested, struggled to maintain order. Through it all, Landon maintained a peculiar serenity. When classmates taunted him about making up stories, he responded with the same gentle understanding he had shown in the hospital. It's okay if you don't believe me, he would say. Jesus said some people wouldn't, but he loves you anyway. Julie found herself learning from her son's example. When faced with hostile questions at the grocery store or suspicious glances at church, she remembered the peace Landon described in his visions. She began hosting small gatherings in their home, where Landon could share his experiences in a safe, intimate setting. These meetings, though modest, began drawing people from surrounding communities. The local youth pastor, Michael Reed, noticed something extraordinary happening among the teenagers who attended these gatherings. Many who had been cynical about faith began asking deeper questions. They were drawn to the authenticity of Landon's story and his unwavering peace in the face of opposition. A few even publicly defended him at school, facing ridicule themselves. As autumn turned to winter, the external opposition remained steady, but something else was growing stronger. People began sharing stories of how Landon's experience had rekindled their faith. A terminally ill patient at the hospital found peace after hearing about his visions. A grieving mother felt comfort in his descriptions of heaven. Even some former skeptics admitted being moved by the way he handled persecution. Julie discovered a network of support she never expected. Anonymous donors helped with bills. Groceries appeared on their porch. Cards and letters of encouragement arrived daily. far outnumbering the negative ones. Martha Stevens called it love's quiet rebellion against fear. Yet the greatest challenge still loomed ahead. James Davidson and his followers were planning something bigger, a coordinated effort to discredit Landon's story once and for all. As Christmas approached, the tension in their small community continued to build, heading toward a confrontation that would test not just Landon's message, but the very nature of faith itself. The confrontation erupted on a cold December morning just 2 weeks before Christmas. James Davidson had orchestrated what he called a revival of truth, inviting a controversial television evangelist, Reverend Walter Kane, to address the dangerous spread of unverified spiritual claims in their community. The event was heavily promoted, drawing hundreds from neighboring towns to First Baptist Church. Reverend Kane, a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit, stood at the pulpit where Andy Whitley had once given his final testimony. His voice boomed through the speakers as he condemned emotional manipulation disguised as miracle. Without naming the Whitleys directly, his message was clear: Landon's story was a threat to true faith. Julie hadn't planned to attend, wanting to protect Landon from the spectacle, but her son had awakened that morning with the same peaceful determination she'd seen in the hospital. "Jesus said we need to be there, Mum," he said simply. Martha Stevens and Dr. Bennett flanked them as they walked into the packed sanctuary, the crowd parting with a mix of whispers and stares. Reverend Kane's sermon reached its crescendo as he spotted Landon in the congregation. "Even Satan can appear as an angel of light," he declared, pointing dramatically. Would God choose a child to deliver messages when he has appointed proper authorities in his church? The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. Then something extraordinary happened. Landon stood up, his small frame somehow commanding attention, even among the hundreds gathered. "Jesus showed me your son," he said clearly, looking directly at Reverend Kane. "The one you never told anyone about. He forgives you for not being there when he needed you." The sanctuary fell silent. Kane's face drained of color. This secret his abandoned son from a relationship before his ministry was known to no one in the room. The evangelist gripped the pulpit, his carefully constructed authority crumbling. Pastor Morgan, who had been watching from the side, stepped forward. "Enough," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "We've let fear and pride blind us long enough." He shared his own story, how his grief over Tommy had poisoned his heart, until Landon's message of love broke through. But James Davidson wasn't finished. He strode to the front, waving papers, medical records he'd somehow obtained, questioning Landon's cardiac arrests. "This is all a performance," he shouted. "A story concocted to manipulate our emotions." Dr. Bennett stood next, her professional reputation on full display. "I certified those deaths myself," she stated firmly. "What I witnessed in that hospital room defied medical explanation. But more importantly, I witnessed love healing what medicine couldn't touch." The tension in the sanctuary was electric. Some people began to leave, unable to handle the intensity. Others moved closer, drawn by the power of the moment. Through it all, Landon remained standing, a picture of supernatural calm in the chaos. Then Martha Stevens began to sing. Her clear voice lifted the old hymn, Amazing Grace, above the tumult. One by one, others joined in, until the sound of unified voices filled the space where argument had raged moments before. Reverend Kane, still shaken, stepped down from the pulpit. He walked slowly toward Landon, the crowd watching in tense silence as the song faded. "My son," he said, his voice breaking, "my Timothy, is he really at peace?" Landon took his hand, the gesture so pure it brought tears to many eyes. "He wants you to forgive yourself," he said softly. "He knows you were young and scared. Love is stronger than any mistake." The atmosphere in the sanctuary transformed. The confrontation intended to discredit Landon had instead demonstrated the very truth he had been trying to share, that love could break through the hardest hearts, that divine knowledge went deeper than human understanding. James Davidson, watching his carefully planned expose unravel, made one last desperate attempt. "This is emotional manipulation," he shouted. But his words fell flat in the face of what people were witnessing, not just a defense of Landon's story, but its message in action. As the crowd began to disperse, some weeping, some deep in thought, some gathering in small groups to pray, Julie held her son close. She remembered Jesus' words in Landon's vision that truth without love brings only pain. Today they had seen the opposite truth wrapped in love had brought healing. Pastor Morgan announced that the church would hold a special service of reconciliation the following Sunday. Reverend Kane, humbled and transformed, asked to participate, not as a television evangelist, but as a father learning to forgive himself. The confrontation had come as Jesus had warned it would, but instead of destroying Landon's message, it had demonstrated its power in a way that no planned testimony could have achieved. The truth had prevailed, not through force or argument, but through the simple, unwavering love of a child who had touched heaven. The aftermath of the church confrontation rippled through Charlotte like shockwaves from an earthquake. The local newspaper's headline read, "Revival Meeting Turns to Revelation TV Evangelist's Secret Past Exposed by 8-Year-Old." By nightfall, regional news stations had picked up the story, their vans parked outside First Baptist Church and the Whitley home. Social media exploded with conflicting narratives. Videos of Landon's exchange with Reverend Kane went viral, sparking heated debates on religious forums. Some claimed it was a staged performance, others saw it as divine intervention. The hashtag #Landon'sTruth trended briefly, drawing attention from national religious commentators and skeptics alike. The congregation splintered into 3 distinct groups. The believers, led by Martha Stevens, rallied around Landon with renewed conviction. The skeptics, though shaken by the revelations about Reverend Kane, maintained their doubts under James Davidson's diminished but persistent leadership. The third group, perhaps the largest, struggled in the middle, uncertain what to believe but unable to deny the power of what they had witnessed. Julie found herself thrust into an unexpected role as gatekeeper. Religious journalists, documentary filmmakers, and book publishers bombarded them with requests for interviews and exclusive rights to Landon's story. Dr. Bennett, now a trusted advisor, helped screen the offers, warning against those who seemed more interested in sensation than substance. Pastor Morgan faced his own challenges. Other local churches questioned his leadership for allowing the controversy to escalate. Some demanded he take a firmer stance against extra-biblical revelations. His response, a sermon series titled "When God Speaks Through Children," drew both criticism and praise, further highlighting the deepening divisions. At Riverside Elementary, the tension became unbearable. Despite support from some teachers and parents, the constant attention and controversy disrupted normal school operations. The principal, after consulting with Julie, suggested homebound instruction for the remainder of the year. It was presented as a practical solution, but Julie recognized it as another form of isolation. The medical community entered the debate when a prominent neurologist published an article attempting to explain Landon's experiences through scientific terms. Dr. Bennett countered with her own detailed medical records, challenging her colleagues to explain how clinical knowledge alone could account for Landon's revelations about people's private lives. Local businesses took sides. The diner where the Whitleys had eaten Sunday lunch for years suddenly became a battleground of competing prayer groups. Some stores displayed signs supporting Landon, others prominently featured books debunking near-death experiences. The community's division manifested in everyday interactions, turning simple errands into potential confrontations. Martha Stevens organized a support network, coordinating volunteers to help the Whitleys deal with the constant attention. They screened mail, monitored social media, and maintained a protective presence around their home. Their dedication moved Julie to tears, reminding her of Jesus' promise that love would attract both opposition and defenders. James Davidson, though publicly quieter after the confrontation, worked behind the scenes. He contacted other churches, warning them about the dangerous precedent of accepting a child's visions as divine revelation. His efforts gained traction among more conservative congregations, leading to a joint statement questioning the biblical validity of Landon's experiences. Yet, even as the community divided, something unexpected began happening. People started sharing their own stories of loss, grief, and supernatural encounters. A quiet grandmother spoke of seeing angels during her cancer treatment. A tough construction worker admitted having a vision of his deceased mother. Landon's courage had somehow given others permission to voice experiences they'd kept hidden for fear of ridicule. The media coverage, though often sensationalized, carried Landon's message far beyond Charlotte. Letters arrived from around the country, many sharing similar experiences or asking for prayers. Julie read each one to Landon, watching as his understanding of his mission deepened. They couldn't respond to all of them, but each story confirmed that their struggle was touching lives in ways they couldn't see. Through it all, Landon maintained the same peaceful demeanor that had marked his hospital stay. When asked about the controversy, he would simply smile and repeat what he'd learned in his visions: love is stronger than fear. His childlike faith, unchanged by either praise or criticism, became its own kind of testimony. As Christmas approached, the divisions showed no sign of healing. Yet beneath the surface conflict, a deeper transformation was taking place. People on both sides found themselves questioning their assumptions about faith, truth, and the nature of divine revelation. The community's struggle with Landon's message had become a mirror, reflecting both their fears and their capacity for belief. In their quiet moments at home, Julie would sometimes find Landon drawing pictures of what he'd seen in heaven. Jesus said it would be like this, he told her one evening, sketching an image of light breaking through darkness. The truth has to hurt before it can heal. His wisdom, far beyond his years, reminded her that their journey was far from over. The division in the community would soon face an even greater test, one that would force everyone to confront not just their beliefs about Landon's experience, but their deepest understanding of faith, truth, and the power of divine love. The true weight of their journey began to show in the quiet moments. Julie found Landon crying in his father's old workshop one evening, clutching Andy's worn Bible. "I miss him so much, Mum," he whispered. "Sometimes I wish I hadn't come back." The words pierced her heart, revealing the burden her 8-year-old son had been carrying beneath his peaceful exterior. The financial strain reached a breaking point in January. Medical bills piled up, and despite the anonymous donations, they couldn't keep up with the mortgage payments. The bank's foreclosure notice arrived the same day as another batch of interview requests from national media outlets, offers that could solve their money problems but would turn Landon's sacred experience into entertainment. Julie's health began to deteriorate under the constant stress. The injuries from the accident, never fully healed, flared up with vengeful intensity. Dr. Bennett, during a checkup, found Julie's blood pressure dangerously high. "You can't be a messenger of love if you're not here to deliver the message," she warned, prescribing rest that they both knew would be impossible to get. Landon's nightmares grew worse. He would wake up screaming about the darkness he'd seen in his visions, about souls lost in shadows of their own making. Julie would hold him, singing hymns until he fell back asleep, all while fighting her own doubts and exhaustion. During one particularly bad night, he looked at her with tears in his eyes and asked, "What if I'm not strong enough, Mom?" The isolation cut deeper than either of them had expected. Former friends crossed the street to avoid them. Julie overheard whispers at the grocery store, "There's that poor woman who lost her mind after her husband died." Even some of Martha Stevens' prayer group members started making excuses not to visit, worn down by the constant controversy surrounding the family. Their home, once a place of warmth and comfort, began to feel like a prison. Reporters camped outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the miracle boy hate mail mixed with prayer requests in their mailbox. Julie installed security cameras after finding their front window shattered one morning, the brick wrapped in a note calling Landon a false prophet. The physical toll on Landon became evident during his homeschool lessons. His concentration wavered, and dark circles appeared under his eyes. The peaceful certainty he'd brought back from his near-death experiences seemed to flicker, tested by the harsh realities of his mission. One afternoon, struggling with simple math problems he would have easily solved before, he broke down. "Jesus didn't tell me it would hurt this much," he sobbed. Pastor Morgan, witnessing their struggle, offered them his family's lake cabin as a refuge. But even this gesture of kindness stirred controversy within the church board. James Davidson accused the pastor of enabling emotional manipulation, and several wealthy congregants threatened to withdraw their financial support. The hardest moments came during their evening prayers. Julie would hear Landon asking God why he'd sent him back if people weren't ready to listen. His childlike faith, though still present, carried a new weight of understanding about human nature and the cost of bearing truth in a world that often preferred comfortable lies. Martha Stevens found Julie crying in the church garden one Sunday morning before services. "I don't know how much more we can take," Julie confessed. "Andy's gone, our savings are gone, Landon's childhood is slipping away. Sometimes I wonder if we're doing more harm than good by sharing his story." The strain showed in simple things: missed meals because Julie was too exhausted to cook, unwashed laundry piling up, Andy's garden withering from neglect. Their home, once filled with music and laughter, grew quiet except for the whispered prayers and muffled sobs that echoed through empty rooms. Yet even in their darkest moments, they clung to the love they'd been called to share. When Julie suggested they might move away and start fresh somewhere else, Landon shook his head with that otherworldly wisdom that both inspired and broke her heart. "We can't run from the light, Mom," he said, "even when it hurts to carry it." The darkness reached its peak on a stormy night in February. Julie woke to the sound of breaking glass and Landon's terrified scream. Racing to his room, she found the window shattered, rain and wind whipping through, and a large rock lying among the scattered shards. Spray painted in red across its surface were the words "Lying Prophet." Dr. Bennett arrived within minutes of Julie's panicked call, finding Landon in shock and Julie trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. As they worked to board up the window, police lights illuminated the street outside. Officer Sarah Collins, taking their statement, seemed skeptical despite the evidence. "Maybe it's just kids," she suggested, though they all knew better. The next morning brought worse news. The church had been vandalized overnight, crude graffiti across its walls questioning Landon's story and calling Pastor Morgan a heretic. But the real blow came when they discovered Andy's grave had been desecrated. Someone had scratched fraud across his headstone and scattered black roses around the plot. James Davidson seized the opportunity, calling an emergency church board meeting. "These incidents prove that the Whitley situation has become dangerous," he declared. "We need to distance ourselves officially from their claims." The vote to suspend their church membership passed by a narrow margin, with even some of their supporters abstaining out of fear. Pastor Morgan resigned in protest, but the damage was done. The local news coverage painted a picture of a community torn apart by religious controversy. Social media exploded with competing hashtags "Stand with Landon" and "Stop the Lays." The division spread beyond their small town, drawing attention from radical religious groups on both sides. That evening, Julie took Landon to the hospital for a scheduled checkup, only to find protesters blocking the entrance. Signs questioned Dr. Bennett's medical integrity and demanded an investigation into the miracle claims. Security had to escort them through a back entrance while angry voices shouted accusations. Inside the hospital, they encountered another kind of darkness. A young cancer patient who had found hope in Landon's story had passed away. Her parents, grief-stricken and angry, confronted them in the corridor. "You gave her false hope," the father accused through tears. "She believed she'd see angels like you did." Landon, devastated, couldn't find words to respond. The weight of it all finally broke through Julie's strength. In the hospital chapel, she fell to her knees, sobbing. "Andy, I can't do this alone," she prayed. How do I protect our son when sharing his gift puts him in danger? The silence that answered seemed heavier than ever before. Martha Stevens, arriving to drive them home, brought more disturbing news. Anonymous letters had been sent to their remaining supporters, threatening to expose personal secrets if they continued standing by the Whitleys. The fear was working their circle of allies growing smaller by the day. That night, as thunder rolled outside their boarded-up window, Landon suffered his worst nightmare yet. He woke up screaming about the darkness he'd seen in his visions, about how it was growing stronger. "What if the darkness wins, Mum?" he asked, his voice small and frightened. For the first time, Julie had no comforting answer to give. The final blow came near midnight, a phone call from their lawyer. The insurance company had found a technicality to deny their remaining accident claims. Without the settlement they'd been counting on, foreclosure wasn't just a threat anymore. It was an inevitability. Julie sat in Andy's old chair, holding his Bible, feeling more alone than ever. The rain beat against the boards covering Landon's window, and somewhere in the distance church bells tolled the midnight hour. Their darkest night seemed complete. But in the depths of that darkness, neither Julie nor Landon could know that dawn was approaching, not just the literal sunrise, but a light that would break through in ways they couldn't imagine. Their faith was being tested in fire, purified through suffering, preparing them for a revelation that would transform not just their lives, but their entire understanding of why they'd been chosen for this journey. The truth broke through on Ash Wednesday in a way no one could have anticipated. Thomas Thompson, who had earlier confessed to framing Andy, suffered a massive heart attack. On what he believed might be his deathbed, he requested to make one final public statement. Local media gathered in the hospital conference room, drawn by rumors of a major revelation. Julie and Landon sat in the front row, beside Pastor Morgan and Martha Stevens. James Davidson stood at the back, his usual confident demeanor showing signs of strain. Dr. Bennett monitored Thomas's condition as he began to speak. The darkness Landon saw in his visions, Thomas began weakly. It wasn't just about faith or love. It was about a web of lies that's poisoned this community for years. He revealed how the church's financial corruption went far deeper than the missing building fund. James Davidson, he explained, had been orchestrating a complex scheme of embezzlement for over a decade. Andy Whitley discovered the truth, Thomas continued, his voice breaking. He found evidence of Davidson's activities just before the accident. That's why I had to frame him. Davidson threatened to expose my own role if I didn't help silence Andy. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to Davidson, who had already started moving toward the door. But it was Landon who stopped him. "Jesus showed me your pain too, Mr. Davidson," he said softly. "He showed me how you lost your family's fortune in bad investments, how you felt responsible for your wife's illness because you couldn't afford better treatment. He wants you to know that money can't heal the hurt inside you." Davidson collapsed into a chair, decades of carefully constructed barriers crumbling. Through tears, he confessed everything: the elaborate financial schemes, the manipulation of church records, the systematic silencing of anyone who got too close to the truth. His campaign against Landon hadn't just been about disproving a miracle, it had been about protecting his own dark secrets. Thomas Thompson wasn't finished. He revealed a final, devastating truth. The driver who had killed Pastor Morgan's son Tommy years ago hadn't been a stranger. It was Davidson's nephew, and Davidson had helped cover up the family connection. The revelation struck Pastor Morgan like a physical blow, years of misdirected grief and anger suddenly focusing on a new target. But before anger could take hold, Landon walked over to Pastor Morgan. "Tommy wants you to remember what you taught him about forgiveness," he said. "He says that holding on to hate was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to die." The words, Tommy's favorite saying from his father's own sermons, cut through the tension like a beam of light. Dr. Bennett, watching the scene unfold, noticed something remarkable. Thomas Thompson's vital signs, which had been critically unstable, began to stabilize as he unburdened himself of the truth. It was as if confession itself had healing power. The local police, who had been quietly investigating the financial discrepancies, moved in to take Davidson into custody. But before they led him away, Landon had one more message. Jesus says it's not too late to choose love, he told Davidson. Even the darkest heart can let in light. Julie watched in awe as years of deception unraveled in a single afternoon. The truth hadn't come through arguments or investigations, but through a series of divine revelations channeled through her 8-year-old son. Andy's name would finally be cleared, though the victory felt bittersweet without him there to witness it. As reporters rushed to file their stories and police gathered evidence, Martha Stevens led the group in prayer. The simple act seemed to transform the sterile hospital conference room into a sanctuary of healing. Even some of the journalists and police officers joined in, moved by the palpable sense of grace in the room. Thomas Thompson survived his heart attack, though the doctors called it miraculous. Perhaps Dr. Bennett noted in his file, the heart can only bear so many secrets before it demands the truth. The revelation had cost him his reputation and would likely lead to criminal charges, but his face showed a peace that had been absent for years. The confession marked a turning point, but not an ending. The community's healing was just beginning, and the Whitleys' journey still had one more crucial chapter to unfold. The transformation of Charlotte began quietly, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a long night. The day after Davidson's arrest, an anonymous donor paid off the Whitleys' mortgage. Then another covered their medical bills. By week's end, a trust fund had been established for Landon's education, with contributions pouring in from across the community. First Baptist Church held a special service of reconciliation, led jointly by Pastor Morgan and religious leaders from neighboring congregations. The sanctuary overflowed as people came to seek and offer forgiveness. Former accusers embraced the accused, years of suspicion dissolving in tears of repentance. Julie watched as Landon moved through the crowd, sharing personal messages of healing that could only have come from heaven. Dr. Bennett presented her complete medical records of Landon's case to a panel of specialists, no longer afraid of professional ridicule. Some things transcend scientific explanation, she testified. Sometimes we have to admit that love and faith can heal what medicine cannot. Her courage inspired other medical professionals to share their own encounters with the inexplicable. The local newspaper printed a front-page apology for their biased coverage, accompanied by a comprehensive investigation into Davidson's financial schemes. The story revealed how many lives had been touched by both the corruption and the healing. Former skeptics came forward to share how Landon's unwavering faith had challenged their cynicism. Martha Stevens organized a community healing service in the park where Landon used to play with Tommy Morgan. Hundreds gathered to hear stories of transformation. Parents who had pulled their children from Julie's class asked for forgiveness. Students who had bullied Landon spoke about how his gentle responses had changed their hearts. Pastor Morgan found healing in an unexpected way. Davidson's nephew, now in recovery from addiction, came forward to take responsibility for Tommy's death. Their meeting, facilitated by Landon, became a powerful testimony to the transformative power of truth and forgiveness. Tommy was right, the pastor declared. Hate is a poison that only love can cure. The police investigation uncovered the full scope of Davidson's corruption, but also revealed stories of redemption. Several of his former conspirators, inspired by Thomas Thompson's confession, came forward voluntarily. Each testified to how Landon's message of love had given them the courage to face the truth. Riverside Elementary invited Landon to return, this time with a new purpose. He began spending time with struggling students, sharing not just his story but the simple wisdom he'd gained about love's power to heal. The school counselor reported a remarkable decrease in bullying incidents wherever Landon's influence reached. The transformation extended beyond Charlotte. News of the community's healing drew attention from people seeking hope in their own struggles. Letters arrived daily, sharing stories of lives changed by hearing about Landon's experiences. Julie helped him respond to as many as they could, always pointing back to the source of true healing. Even those who had been Davidson's strongest supporters found their way to reconciliation. The church board members who had voted to suspend the Whitleys' membership now worked tirelessly to restore broken relationships. Their humility sparked a renewal of authentic faith throughout the congregation. As spring approached, the physical scars of that dark period began to heal. The church's vandalism was cleaned away, replaced by a mural depicting light breaking through darkness. Andy's restored headstone became a place of prayer and reflection, where people often reported feeling a profound sense of peace. The community's transformation culminated in a decision to convert the failed youth center project into a healing ministry. Named in honor of both Tommy Morgan and Andy Whitley, it would be a place where people could share their experiences of divine love without fear of judgment. Through it all, Landon remained the same gentle soul who had returned from death with a message of love. His childlike faith, now vindicated, continued to disarm skeptics and inspire believers. As Julie watched her son playing in the spring sunshine, she realized that their darkest trial had indeed yielded to the brightest dawn. The truth had prevailed, not through force or argument, but through the persistent power of love to transform hearts. Charlotte would never be the same, and neither would the countless lives touched by a child's journey to heaven and back. 1 year after the accident that changed everything, First Baptist Church of Charlotte celebrated a different kind of miracle. The Tommy Morgan and Andy Whitley Center for Healing opened its doors, transformed from the building that had once been at the center of so much controversy. The modern facility, with its walls of windows letting in natural light, stood as a testament to how darkness could give way to dawn. Julie Whitley, now serving as the center's director, watched as Landon cut the ribbon at the opening ceremony. Her son had grown taller over the past year, but maintained that otherworldly wisdom in his eyes. The crowd that gathered included faces from every chapter of their journey: Dr. Bennett, Martha Stevens, Pastor Morgan, and even Thomas Thompson, recently released from prison and working as the center's maintenance supervisor. The center quickly became a sanctuary for those wrestling with grief, doubt, and spiritual questions. People traveled from across the country to share their stories of loss and supernatural encounters. Julie established strict protocols: no media, no recordings, just authentic sharing in a space of unconditional love. Landon participated when he felt led to, sharing insights that continued to bridge the gap between heaven and earth. Dr. Bennett established a research wing dedicated to studying the intersection of faith and healing. Her team documented countless cases of physical and emotional recovery that defied medical explanation. "We're not trying to prove anything," she would explain. "We're simply creating space for mystery to coexist with medicine." Pastor Morgan, his own heart healed through the journey, developed a ministry for grieving parents. The lessons learned from Tommy's death and his own journey from bitterness to grace helped others navigate similar paths. His sessions often ended with Landon sharing messages of comfort that only a child who had glimpsed heaven could deliver. The Whitley home, once a target of vandalism, became a place of pilgrimage for those seeking hope. Julie and Landon hosted small groups in their living room, where Andy's presence was still felt in the family photos and well-worn Bible on the coffee table. These intimate gatherings often proved more transformative than larger events at the center. Martha Stevens coordinated a network of support families who opened their homes to visitors from out of town. The community that had once been torn apart by suspicion now became known for its radical hospitality. Local businesses donated meals, hotels offered discounted rates, and volunteers provided transportation to those making spiritual pilgrimages to Charlotte. Landon returned to regular school, where his presence transformed the atmosphere. Teachers reported a marked decrease in bullying and an increase in empathy among students. His classmates, who had once ostracized him, now sought his quiet wisdom during playground conflicts. He remained humble, always pointing to the source of his insights rather than claiming any special status. The legal system showed its own kind of healing. The judge in Davidson's case, moved by Landon's advocacy for mercy, incorporated rehabilitation and restitution into the sentence rather than pure punishment. Davidson began writing letters from prison, sharing his journey from deception to truth, helping others face their own darkness. Financial restoration came in unexpected ways. Anonymous donations continued to support the center's work, but more meaningful was the community's commitment to ensuring no one was turned away for lack of funds. A spirit of generosity replaced the former focus on financial gain that had corrupted the church. Professional skeptics and religious critics still occasionally challenged Landon's story, but their voices held less power now. The transformations happening daily at the center spoke louder than any argument. Lives were being changed, not through spectacular displays, but through the patient work of love breaking down walls of fear and doubt. Julie found her own healing as she guided others. The grief of losing Andy never fully disappeared, but it was transformed into a deeper understanding of the thin veil between heaven and earth. She saw him in Landon's smile, heard him in their evening prayers, and felt his presence in the work they were doing. As the center's first year drew to a close, they added a memorial garden where people could reflect and pray. At its center stood a simple plaque with words from Landon's vision: "Love is stronger than fear, truth is stronger than darkness, and heaven is closer than we think." The garden became a physical representation of what the entire community had learned, that sometimes the deepest wounds can become the most powerful sources of healing. In the quiet of his father's old workshop, now transformed into an art room, Landon sat drawing images from his heavenly encounters. At 9 years old, his artistic skill had grown along with his understanding of his mission. Julie watched from the doorway as he sketched angels, golden light, and the faces of those he'd met beyond the veil. "Mom," he said without looking up, "Jesus told me it's time to share the final part of the message." His hand moved across the paper, creating an image of light breaking through storm clouds. "People are starting to understand about love, but there's more they need to know." The next Sunday, First Baptist Church fell silent as Landon stood at the pulpit where his father had once stood. His voice, though still that of a child, carried the weight of divine wisdom. "Heaven sent me back with 3 truths," he began. "Love is the answer, fear is the lie, and everyone has a choice." He shared how Jesus had shown him 2 possible futures for humanity. In one, people chose love over fear, forgiveness over judgment, truth over comfort. Communities healed, hearts opened, and the light grew stronger than the darkness. In the other, fear won, turning people against each other until the shadows consumed everything. But here's the most important part, Landon continued, his eyes scanning the congregation. "The choice isn't just once. It's every day, every moment. When someone hurts you, you choose. When you're scared, you choose. When it's hard to believe, you choose. And every time you choose love, the light gets a little brighter." The message spread beyond Charlotte through a series of small gatherings rather than large events. Julie and Landon traveled to neighboring communities, sharing their story in living rooms and church basements. They refused interviews with major media outlets, understanding that the message needed to be experienced personally rather than broadcast. Dr. Bennett documented the ongoing impact in her research, noting how the simple truth of Landon's message transcended religious and cultural boundaries. People from different faiths found common ground in the universal experience of love overcoming fear. The center became a model for similar institutions around the country. Pastor Morgan, speaking at a regional conference, summed up the transformation they'd witnessed. "We thought we were getting a miracle story about a boy who came back from death. Instead, we got a living testimony about how to choose life every day." The final piece of Landon's message emerged during a quiet evening at home. "Jesus showed me that everyone has a little piece of heaven inside them," he explained to Julie. "When we choose love, we let that piece shine. When enough people let their light shine, the darkness doesn't have anywhere to hide. Martha Stevens organized a candlelight vigil to celebrate this revelation. Thousands gathered in the town square, each person lighting their candle from another's flame. The sight of light spreading through the crowd became a living metaphor for the truth Landon had brought back from heaven. Even James Davidson, writing from prison, contributed to the final message. His letter, read aloud at the center, described how choosing fear had darkened his world until love broke through. The miracle wasn't just Landon's experience, he wrote. The miracle is that we all have the same choice he described. The Tommy Morgan and Andy Whitley Center established a tradition of concluding each day with a simple ceremony. Visitors and staff gathered in the memorial garden, where Landon's original drawings hung in weatherproof frames. Together, they would recite the truth that had transformed their community. Love is a choice. Fear is a lie. Light lives in everyone. Heaven is watching. Truth will prevail. As Julie tucked Landon into bed on the anniversary of his return, she asked if he had shared everything from his visions. He smiled, that same peaceful smile that had sustained them through their darkest days. "The message isn't just words," Mommy said. "It's how we live, and we're still living it." The light in his room seemed to glow a bit brighter, reminiscent of the divine light he'd described. In that moment, Julie understood that their story wasn't ending, it was spreading, one heart at a time, as people everywhere faced the same choice between love and fear, light and darkness, truth and deception. The final message was simple, but eternal heaven's light could shine through anyone who chose to let love win. Thank you for experiencing Landon's profound journey with us. If this story touched your heart or resonated with your own experiences, please share your thoughts in the comments below. We deeply value your perspective and would love to hear how this message of love, faith, and redemption impacted you. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to support our team's mission of sharing more inspiring stories like this one. Hit the like button if you believe in the power of love to overcome darkness, and share this video with friends and family who might need this message of hope today. Together we can spread the light, one heart at a time.